Hi there, friends. Welcome back to the Daily Bible Project podcast on our journey together through the whole Bible. And we're in episode 212, which is part 143 of our short daily Bible studies, working through, Lord willing, the whole Bible. Now, if you've just dropped in with us today, I make a strong recommendation that why don't you join us on this entire journey together. Now, you can do that one of two ways. You can go right back to the very first episode and go through season 1, where it'll give you an overview of the entire Bible. 66 short 6-minute podcast giving a background and overview of each and every one of the books of our Bible. And then we launched off together in our second season when we began the process of working through the book of Genesis. And that's where we are today. And as I said, we're in part 143 and we're considering the second half of Genesis chapter 18, looking at this impending judgment on Sodom and asking why did God judge then and why doesn't God judge the world today? Now, for many people who read this section, the opening conversation described here between Abraham and God really does identify and teach some very helpful spiritual truths. Firstly, as I pointed out last time, God is seen to reveal his truth to those that he calls his friends, actually is the term that used. But in turn, we are guided that we should share those truths with other people. So the important truth here is that if you consider yourself as having a relationship with the Lord, then you should do, as best you can, you should plan to share the insights he gives you with others. But there's a second great spiritual truth revealed here, and that it is God's intention to judge sin. We see in this chapter a big point being made in the fact that God, having a conversation with himself, muses and then decides to tell Abraham about what he's planning to do to Sodom and Gomorrah, which is to judge those cities. Now, God will always share his truth with believers, and one of the great truths as a general principle is that of his judgment and his grace. Two sides of the same coin. And he's about to give here Abraham an insight into what that will mean in respect of the city of Sodom. All right, so that's God's plan. His plan is that he's going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. But what was his motivation? Well, it tells us in the two verses we're considering today, verses 20 and 21, where it says this. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. Now, this is very interesting, isn't it? The little comment about the wickedness of Sodom being so great that the people are crying out to him, and that his response is to go down and investigate. So God's making a case that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah have sinned so much that God has heard about what is going on from the crying out of the people of those cities. Now, that's a common biblical motif. The idea being that the sin and the noise, the clamour, if you like, of humanity can be raised up in such a way that God can hear it and sometimes can be forced to respond or maybe even intervene. What it means to me is that God could sometimes become so offended with the situation that in a spiritual sense he is drawn down to act within it. Now, I'm going to see if it's as bad as I'm hearing in heaven, as how it is described here. Obviously, again, God has been seen here to take on human characteristics in a way that we can identify with him more closely, because we all can understand how God might feel. We all perhaps feel something similar when we hear about a terrible atrocity in the world. We can all hear those cries also in our imagination. And if we don't, then perhaps we have become too hardened by sin in the world to hear them. I think in a spiritual sense, we should all hear the terrified cry of a child whose mother is being beaten, or the cry of an elderly person being attacked, Or what about the teenage girl being assaulted, or the cry of a wife being beaten or abandoned by her husband? We too should also hear the cry of broken people trapped by mental illness to the point where they feel like giving up. I hear the echoing of those cries across thousands of towns and cities. What about the cries of people trapped in prostitution, those in the grips of drug addiction? But wait, those cries, they're only a fraction of the millions and millions, perhaps billions of cries that every day of every year rise up from villages and towns around the world. Our nations cry out, our churches cry out, and we cry out too. And all those cries of the heart, beloved, they are truly heard by God. Yet God's judgment must not fall too quickly, or how should as many as possible escape? God hears the cry, and yet God says, as bad as it is, we need to understand the implication of the response to that cry, if that cry is for God to come down and judge sin. We can't avoid that factor. The Bible is full of it, the fact that God judges sin, and he does so justly. God is just and God is fair. We've just seen that in his dealing with Hagar in chapter 17 and here so far in Genesis chapter 18. And he has been gracious up to this point with Sodom. God has been just in his dealings with Sodom thus far, but Sodom has refused to hear, so his judgment on them will eventually fall if they don't respond. So it is at this point that Abraham is given, and he gets the message, and he understands that God's intent is to judge the city. And his response? Well, his response is to start praying, and it's to respond in a certain type of prayer. This is the first time in the Bible, in fact, we shall see this type of prayer. A prayer which we can discover in a sense that it is that God is called, and we are able to intercede with God on behalf of people, or on behalf of a situation, and in faith and trust that God will respond in the right way. This is a call to intercessory prayer. It concerns me sometimes that Christians are too eager, too quick to call down the judgment of God, when our response should clearly be first to intercede, to pray that God would tarry in his judgment. So we're going to continue to look at Abraham's prayer of intercession and see how that plays out, and we'll do that together in the next episode. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time on the Daily Bible Project Podcast. Bye-bye for now.